Alexander here, and we are going to look at chapter 5. Take notes, folks. Again, I'll always remind you, take notes. When you write, you retain. You're not going to retain all the information, but retaining some of that information and going back and looking at key points is how we learn and how we retrieve that information and have that information going from the short term to the long term memory. So, without further ado, we are going to be looking at chapter 5, right, which deals with gender, gender roles, and sexuality. Take notes, folks. As I'm talking, you are writing. So, one of the things that some of the topics that we are going to cover is studying gender, gender roles and sexuality, gender role learning, like how it happens over the course of our childhood, adolescence, all the way into adulthood, contemporary gender roles and scripts, gender variation, studying gender and gender roles and sexuality. So most people distinguish their sex by the appearance of their genitals, especially early on. Others rely on their gender identity, which happens internally, right? But sometimes the gender identity can be forced on us by our communities or our neighborhoods or the people around us. So culture encourages us to accentuate or invent psychological, emotional, and mental and behavioral differences between men and women. So gender identity is a social construct, right? It's constructed by society. Sex, gender, and gender roles, what's the difference? So a few terms that we are going to become very familiar with throughout this quarter is assigned sex, whether one is biologically female or male. Social constructs, again, folks. Genetic sex, one's chromosomal and hormonal sex characteristics, such as whether one's chromosomes are XX or XY, or whether estrogen or testosterone dominates. This is not a social construct. Either you are born with these chromosomes or you are born without them. Anatomical sex, physical sex, as in gonads, uterus, vulva, vagina, penis, and so on. So when we talk about gender, this is the social and cultural characteristics associated with biological sex rooted in culture. These are social constructs, all right? Not genetic sex. Assigned gender is gender given by others, usually at birth, right? Gender identity, a person's internal sense of being male or female or other. Gender roles is attitudes, behaviors, rights, and responsibilities associated with each sex. So gender role stereotypes, rigid and generalized beliefs about how each gender should behave. They tend to be false or misleading, right? Even if generalization is statistically valid in describing a group's average, such generalizations do not necessarily predict reality. Okay, you have to be aware of these generalizations, right? You can't just make a sweeping statement for all people or all groups. There's some variation in that. Sex and gender identity, gender binary or culture's emphasis on there being only two genders, an either or option. Cisgender, a person whose gender identity matches the biological sex that were assigned at birth, right? Cisgender is a term that has become into view or into human sexuality within the last 7 or 8 years. Cisgender, a person whose gender identity matches the biological sex that were assigned at birth. We used to call cisgender, it used to be heterosexual. Now we are referring to as cisgender. It's just a different term. We're saying heterosexual individuals. Gender variant or gender non-conforming, those whose question their gender are uncertain, are unwilling to state, or feel limited by categories male or female. Other terms include gender atypical behavior, gender identity disorder, gender dysmorphia. And we are going to talk about this. All right. So increasingly viewed as dysphoria. Increasingly viewed as natural and normal on the spectrum of gender expression. So we as a society, we've looked at natural and unnatural, right and wrong, moral and immoral, but we are going to use the term sexual variation, right, in terms of gender expression, in terms of how cultures view sexuality. Sexual variation. Gender we are assigned at birth tells others how to respond to us. By the age of 2, we internalize and identify with our gender. So some individuals embrace a non-binary option, also known as agender, bigender, genderqueer, gender fluid, or pangender. Some cultures recognize that sex and gender are not always divided along binary lines. Transgender is an umbrella term for those whose gender expression or identity is not congruent with the sex assigned at birth. Masculinity, femininity, opposites, similar or blended. Culture determines the content of gender roles in its own way. However, cultural norms fluctuate and change with time and across cultures. So examples are the Arapesh of New Guinea, right? Both sexes have what we consider feminine traits and both bear a child, right? So nearby Mungdumar, both sexes exhibit what we consider masculine traits. Traditional Western view, men and women are seen as polar opposites. Again, I am scratching the surface on the New Guinea and the Mundugumar, right? So look those up. Look in our textbooks. Read a little bit more about the New Guinea, right? And traditional Western views and sexual variation, right? So when we talk about Western gender stereotypes, they fit the pattern of polar differences. There's a lot of jargon, so feel free to pause the video, come back and review. Men embody instrumentality and are task oriented, right? Men typically want to get things accomplished, right? So women embody, not saying that women don't, but men tend to be a little bit more task oriented early on. Women embody expressiveness and communication and are emotion oriented, right? And this is very stereotypical. So gender stereotypes are changing, however. Female stereotypes in particular have become more fluid. Changes are mostly linked to global shifts in culture, politics, and economics. Technology is helping us see how male and female identities are a combination of nature and nurture. Masculinity and femininity, opposites, similar, or blended. Sexism, discrimination against people based on their sex rather than their individual merits. This is often associated with gender stereotypes. It may prevent individuals from expressing their full range of emotions or seeking certain vocations, right? Folks have been discriminated against. Women in particular have been discriminated against since the beginning of time. Misogyny is a more hostile form of prejudice that involves the hatred of or disdain for women. So if you see it, call somebody on it, right? Gender and sexual orientation. Many people see gender identity, and gender roles as closely related to sexual orientation. Heterosexuality is a critical component of masculinity and femininity. Homosexuality is somehow associated with a failure to fulfill traditional gender roles. Homosexuality is somehow associated with a failure to fill traditional gender roles. There is no failure in that, right? You are who you are. Heteronormativity position that people fall into distinct genders, distinct categories with natural roles and are presumed to be heterosexual, right? We must dismantle this. We must tear this heteronormativity apart. It supports negative stereotypes about homosexuality, right? Again, we're talking about right and wrong, black and white. Okay, we have to become folks that view people's identity as a commonplace. Or again, sexual variation, right? No moral or immoral, just sexual variation. Gender role learning, theories of socialization. Cognitive social learning theories that attitudes and behaviors are a result of social learning. Consequences control behavior. An example, our girls are rewarded by playing with dolls when boys are not encouraged, right? When boys are supposed to be rough and tumble. right? Wrestle, fight, play with Tonka trucks and toy soldiers, right? We are socializing young kids into these roles, and maybe a boy wants to play with the doll. Cognitive, and that's okay. Cognitive processing involved in social learning, the use of language, anticipating consequences, making observations. Socialization continued. Cognitive development theory focuses on children's active interpretation of messages received from the environment. Learning, including about gender, differs depending on age. Social construction theory is gender as a set of practices and performances that occur through language and political system. Queer theory is gender and sexuality are systems that are not gender neutral and cannot be understood by the actions of heterosexual males and females. Look up these different definitions, take time in writing them down, unpack these different definitions by pausing the video and going to the internet or textbook. Gender role learning in childhood and adolescence. The learning begins at birth. Parents are important socializing agents. Subtle processes include manipulation, channeling, verbal appellation, and activity exposure. Verbal appellation just refers to the convincing that something is more desirable than the other, right? Again, it's subtle. It happens through manipulation, channeling, a different activity exposure when we are trying to force young children into specific gender roles that are happening in childhood and adolescence. Gender role learning in childhood and adolescence continued. Other important socializing agents are teachers in the classroom. Also, your college experience, whether or not you go into a particular gender role and it's embarrassing to you, right? Or your friends don't approve. They disapprove of your actions. So peers or age mates, right? Folks in your group, your peers, who become especially important when children enter school, right? Play activities and toys, right? I gave you the doll and the G.I. Joe or the toy soldier example, right? It's play activities, verbal approval or disapproval in the adoption of gender role norms, perceptions of friends, gender role attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs. So the media, we also know from previous chapter, influences, including both programming and in advertising. Gender schemas, exaggerating differences. Culture exaggerates differences between females and males or creates differences where few otherwise exist. A gender schema is, you will hear this term again and again when you take my course. This is the cognitive, right? That's the mental organization of the world according to gender. So the breakdown of gender schema, cultures such as ours make multiple associations with gender and other non-sex linked qualities such as affection and strength. Gender distinctions form the basis of culture norms, status, taboos, and privileges, and often undermine and undervalue the uniqueness of individuals. You might want to write that down. This is definitely going to come up on a test. Gender schema. You need to understand what this is. Contemporary gender roles and scripts. In the past several decades, there has been a shift towards more egalitarian gender roles. That is equal, right? Or equity-based gender roles where we're on the same playing field. So women's roles have changed more than men's, but men's are also changing, right? So members of conservative religious groups still tend to adhere more strongly to traditional gender roles. Traditional gender roles and scripts. Traditional male gender roles, aggressiveness, emotional toughness, independence, feelings of superiority, and decisiveness. These are gender roles. These are scripts. These are also stereotypes. Regarded as being more power oriented and competitive. Traditional female gender roles are passivity, compliance, physical attractiveness, and being a partner or wife and mother. Work roles are subordinated to marital and family roles. The script, behaviors, rules, and expectations of a role. Sexual scripts. In the male sexual script, sex is seen as performance. Men should not have or express certain feelings. Performance is the thing that counts. The man is in charge. A man always wants sex and is ready for it. All physical contact leads to sex. Sex equals intercourse. Sexual intercourse leads to orgasm. Female sexual script focuses on feelings over sex. Sex is good and bad. It is not okay to touch themselves down there. Sex is for men. Men should know what women want. Women should talk about sex. Shouldn't talk about sex. Women should look like models. Women are nurturers. There is only one way to have an orgasm. No, no, no. Dismantle sexual scripts. I don't like these. These are inaccurate. No, no, no. Changing gender roles and scripts. Contemporary gender roles often display traditional elements along with egalitarian and androgynous ones, right? Equal a value, right? Contemporary gender roles often display traditional elements along with egalitarian and androgynous ones, right? And we're going to dive deeper into what that means. So, contemporary sexual scripts for both sexes, sexual expression is positive and healthy. Sexual activities involve exchange of erotic pleasure. Sexuality is equally involving, and both partners are equally responsible. Legitimate sexual activities are not limited to intercourse. Sexual activities may be initiated by either partner and should always be consensual. Both partners have the freedom to accept sexual pleasure and experience orgasm. Yes, 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 yes. This is where we need to be evolving to, right? Lots of work still needs to be done. Gender variations. Psychosexual development is influenced by multiple factors, including the following: exposure to androgens, sex chromosome genes, your brain structure, your brain chemistry, social circumstances, family dynamics, right? Your culture, your family, neighborhood, your church. Many people find it difficult to accept the concept of gender continuum that reflects the diversity of human expression. Since human beings are very diverse as people worldwide, then of course human expression and human sexuality is going to be very diverse worldwide. Now take time. This is figure one. Pause, take time, take notes, reflect. This is gender variation, the gender continuum, right? And Dr. Alfred Kinsey was one of the first ones to talk about the gender continuum. So, in contrast to the traditional binary view, the concepts of sex and gender and sexual orientation are complex, multidimensional, and how people identify and express themselves can change, as can their pattern of sexual attraction. On the left-hand side, we have male, man, boy, masculine, attracted to women in the orange. Then the variation in the middle, we have sex, intersex, transgender, gender queer, two-spirited, under gender expression, androgynous, sexual orientation, attracted to all, both, and none. On the right-hand side, we have female, women/girl, feminine, and attracted to men. So there are sexual variations, gender variations, and this is oftentimes referred to as a gender continuum. And where you fall on the gender continuum during one part of your life may not be where you fall at a different part of your life, right? We are, as human beings, we are forever evolving. The transgender phenomenon is not a phenomenon to transgender. So transgender, an umbrella term for all the identities that fall outside of traditional gender norms. You are who you are. So embraces the possibility of numerous genders and multiple social identities. Androgyny, the definition for androgyny is a combination of masculine and feminine traits or a non-traditional gender expression. This is a good opportunity to write down the definition of androgyny because this is going to come up again and it will be on the test. Again, is a combination of masculine and feminine traits or a non-traditional gender expression. Transgender youth, right? Look up the group Youth Spaces out of San Jose Youth Spaces is a combination of the LGBTQ plus community and how we support transgender youth and members of LGBTQ plus. Number of children identifying as transgender continues to grow. So, like adults, these individuals feel a strong conflict between the gender and their physical sex characteristics. The model adhered to by many healthcare professionals is that children who are insistent, persistent, and consistent in expression a gender other than the one assigned at birth should be able to socially transition. Gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a diagnosis that emphasizes the individual's felt sense of incongruence and natal gender, including intense discomfort and distress. So basically, in layman terms, is when how you are as a person doesn't match with how society views your gender, right? So your gender identity doesn't match with how folks viewed you at birth, right? The natal gender. So many such individuals live as their desired gender and may seek gender confirming treatment, okay, known as gender reassignment surgery or gender affirmation, right? Gender confirming treatment is known as gender reassignment surgery or gender affirmation. Separate criteria are considered with children, adolescents, and adults. Disorders and chromosomal variations, disorders of sex development, DSD, a range of medical conditions where there is discrepancy between the external and internal genitals. Two syndromes resulting from erroneous chromosomal. Turner syndrome, a genetic condition in which a female does not have the usual pair of two X chromosomes. Klinefelter syndrome, where males have one or more extra chromosomes. We're gonna look a little bit deeper into that. All right. So figure 3 shows the characteristics of somebody that has Klinefelter syndrome. Right. Tall stature, lack of facial hair, the tendency to lose chest hairs, breast development, a short trunk. They may develop osteoporosis earlier on. Female type pubic hair pattern, undersized penis, small firm testicles, long legs that are affiliated with you typically affiliated with male gender, slightly feminized physique, right? So again, Klinefelter, the males have one or more extra chromosomes, so they take on some female or femininity traits. Prenatal hormonal variations. So prenatal hormonal anomalies, androgen insensitivity syndrome or AIS, when a person is genetically male but is resistant to male hormones or androgens, the body builds up a resistance to those. That's AIS. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia is a group of inherited disorders of the adrenal gland, can affect boys and girls. So 5 alpha reductase deficiency is a condition whereby a genetic male will not produce enough of a hormone called dihydrotestosterone, DHT. I'm going to try to say that again. Dihydrotestosterone, DHT. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia, 5 alpha reductase deficiency. Ooh, try saying that 5 times fast. Gender variations, coming to terms with differences. So most societies have a difficult time with differences, right? As we know, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community. Otherwise, there wouldn't be racism and prejudice. So rejection and loss are common concern for those facing gender transition. And some feel their only choice is transition or suicide. This is tough. Most professionals agree that the more one educates oneself and talks about the issues, the easier it gets. In 2016, the U.S. Department of Education and Justice issued joint guidance for schools to ensure all students are treated equally consistent with their gender identity. Gender variations, coming to terms with differences. Self-acceptance can be a gateway to building intimacy, and a better understanding of gender issues and differences can strengthen pleasure and satisfaction. Schools must provide a safe space for all, including LGBTQ plus and all students. Title IX says an educational amendment that protects people from sex discrimination in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. So Title IX is all throughout the four-year college system as well as the community college system. All colleges, right? We have to adhere to Title IX standards, which is an educational amendment that protects people from sex discrimination in programs like sports, um, things that happen within the classroom, or activities that receive federal financial assistance. Certain best practices support transgender and other gender nonconforming students on campus, including adding the phrase gender identity or expression to institutions' non-discrimination policy, asking gender identity on college forums and surveys, enabling students to choose their gender and use a chosen name in records and documents, offering gender inclusive bathrooms and housing, enabling insurance coverage for therapies and surgeries. So we have studied gender, gender roles, sexuality, gender role learning, gender role scripts, and gender variation. We have taken a deep dive, but again, you as a student, as a lifelong learner, you have the ability to take even a deeper dive, right? That is going to the internet, fact checking, looking at your textbook to understand more, right? Going back and reviewing your notes early and often. This is something that I encourage you to do after reviewing or looking at a PowerPoint for every chapter, right? This is how we retain information. Moving that info from your short term to your long term memory is what we hope to do, right? You want it to be 4 or 5 years from now and still retrieve that information. I'm Professor Alexander, and I'll see you guys next chapter.